she's an interesting woman. What I've discovered really, she's a very modern woman. Her work basically, although I personally I don't particularly like her work, that really isn't the point. The thing is that she's very, very important for women, because she's the first artist who really describes what it's like to be a woman with well, I don't want to say educated because that is mean. I don't want to say educated, but I want to say a woman who's got an idea that they would like to do something other than be married and have children. And they have, therefore, some kind of career. This has been brought home to me recently because in my own family, there is a daughter-in-law of Simon's who the family don't approve of because she is a businesswoman and she has enough money to have her children being educated or brought up really by other people. And the family think this is very unmotherly. And I've been interested again about Louise Bourgeois because this is basically what her work is about. She sees a woman as an individual, completely not particularly female, not particularly male, but an individual who who bears children. But it does mean that she has, for the very long part of her life, devoted in bringing them up. In her own case, she was 71 years old when she had her first important exhibition at MoMA. 71 years old. Her children had gone away, her husband had died, and she was able to produce her own work. Now think about that in terms of male, female. Her husband was one of the most important art historians of his day. He didn't have to give up his work in order to bring up the children. Just the thought. Let's put the first ones on, and I'll show you. She was actually born. She was born in. I now always forget. I'm terrible about this. I always forget her date. She was born in 1911. Now here she is on the first exhibition. The first photograph is her on the left, and it's photographed by Brancus. Now she came from a middle-class family. Her parents were sort of antique dealers, but specifically in tapestry. And her mother and she, as a little girl, very small child, was encouraged to both draw and also to repair ancient tapestries, because this is what they sold. They lived in the Saint-Germain area of Paris, and they had a house in the country, a place called Toisy, which we will look at the beginning. Now, she was a clever child, and she went to a rather expensive school, but eventually she went to the Sorbonne, and she actually read philosophy and mathematics. And her particular paper was on Kant. But after this, her mother died in 1932, and she was completely decided that she would want to be an artist. Her father was not happy about this, because at that point she was helping to run this business. She had a sister and a brother. The brother was born after her, and there's something a bit mysterious about him. It appears that there was something mentally wrong with him, because he spent his life in an asylum, but we don't know really why. It's never discussed in her biography. But the point about that I want to make is that she was in Paris at the time of the great modernist. She knew Bonnard, she knew Matisse, she knew Picasso. And what we're seeing in that first photograph there is herself in the studio of Leger, but it's photographed by Brancus. She was right involved with the intellectual Parisian life. She decided she wanted to become an artist, and she went and worked in various studios, and this is when this photograph was taken. she became sort of interested in sort of slight dealing. She began to collect prints, and in her father's shop in Saint-Germain, he gave her a sort of space there, and she had a sort of a small little business selling prints. And one day in walks Robert Goldwater, and he was this American art historian, to buy Picasso prints. And this was in 1938. And later that year, they married. And the middle photograph is herself in New York with her 3 sons. Now, the eldest, the one on the extreme right, was actually adopted. When they first married, for some reason she thought she couldn't have children, and they went back to France to adopt an orphan, and he was a little orphan. That was Michel on the right. He was born in 1936. When she came back to America, to her presumably her astonishment, she had 2 more children. The middle one is Jean-Louis, and the last one is called Elaine. Now that particular child now is a judge, a retired judge. Now Jean-Louis, and Elaine was born in 41. Jean-Louis was born in 40, and the first little boy was born in 1936. Now on the extreme right, there's a photograph of her when she's famous. This is 1990, and the photograph is her standing behind one of her sculptures, which is called Eye to Eye, which was actually made in 1970. Now, what is important to remember is that she never financially needed money in her entire life. In that sense, she's very unlike most artists. She was married to a very, very famous art historian. When I say famous, his great friend was Alfred Barr, the curator of MoMA, and Greenberg. She knew all of them. And so through him, not only did she know all the contemporary intellectual artists in New York, she also was therefore right in the front when the refugees from the Nazi war came over to America. And so then she knew Miro, she knew Duchamp and Ernst. So she was very, very much involved in the art world. I think this is important to know. However, she was always, when she went there, part-time, she went to the Art Students League, and she was always working in sculpture, because when she worked with Leger said to her she was more of a sculptor than she was a painter. And so this is basically what she did. Okay, next one. And we can see this is her on her wedding day. And this is the wedding of 1938. And there is Professor Goldwater. And as I say, his particular interest was African art, and particularly early African art, primitive art. And he was his patron was Rockefeller, and he became the first professor of primitive art in New York. And what we're seeing on the right there is a salon in the Metropolitan, which is devoted to his name. It's called the Goldwater Park, and it, of course, is full of African art, because this is what she was involved with in New York. I think this is very important, because it's important for her own work. You have to remember that not only was she able to know about this African art, she was actually able to handle it, because he was, as I say, the professor of primitive art. Okay, next one. Now, this is when she first begins to describe her feelings about being a wife and mother. She sees herself as part of the family, a part of the house. You see her, she calls these works femme maison, and they're all done between 1946 to 1947. And this is the time, if you remember, that the Surrealists are dominating the American art world, because they've all come over from France. And you see they're very interesting, because she feels that the household was a feminine thing, because after all, not only was she the mother of these 3 children, she had to be, because of her husband's position, a hostess. So her life was completely taken up with literally looking after other people, and therefore her time for her own work was very limited. And there she expresses this by these female figures with this straight house at the top, and they're very interesting. And she said about herself that they lived at that particular moment in Manhattan. And if they do the next one, and you can see who she was looking at. She says, as a girl, she met Brancusi. And there's no doubt that Brancusi becomes one of her major influences, although she never claims it. Because what we're looking at now, we're looking at Brancusi's studio in Paris. He was born in 1876, he died in 1957. And this is what his studio looked like. And she says later on, she kept diaries from the age of 23. And she says that in one of these diaries that she and Robert went back to Paris after the war. And one of the first places they went to was Brancusi. So she knew about Brancusi's studio. Now, of course, you will know the picture, the Giacometti on the right. What is particularly interesting in this particular Giacometti is that it was bought by Peggy Guggenheim. And you remember that Peggy Guggenheim did Art of the Century, and she had this big exhibition where, of course, all of the expatriate French people, Breton, etc., and all went. And she had an exhibition of women, and in 1945, Bourgeois was one of those artists, and she had this exhibition. But of course, this particular Giacometti, she saw. Giacometti was born 1901. He died in 66. So, he came to America finally, but this was after literally, but towards the end of his life. Okay, next one. He wasn't one of the group. Now, this is very interesting photograph, because this is the way where she works at this particular moment. So we're looking at the top on the first left. We're looking on the top of her roof in the apartment, which was in East 18th Street in Manhattan. And she's working on the roof, and she's working as a sculptor. She's working with discarded pieces of wood she finds all over the place. And she makes these extraordinary images with them. She called them personages. She says later that they were part of her memory of her friends and the people she'd left in Paris all those times ago. The middle one is called Persistent Antagonism, and this is 1946 to 48. And the group on the right is a group together called Personages. And this particular group of pictures, which were called Quarantaniana, which she did in 1945 to 1955. And her husband persuaded a donor to buy them and to give them to MoMA. So they appear, and they still are, in MoMA. So you see, she was not unknown. Okay, next one. It's an interesting thing, because here we see on the left the way they were placed. Now, what was interesting, particularly interesting about them, is that they weren't on the wall. When you went into this particular gallery, and this particular one was, you walked through the sculpture, you actually became part of these personages. The one in the center, the particular one in the center is called the listening ones, and this is 1947. By this time, in the 1950s, she was having exhibitions. She had an exhibition at the Pompidou Gallery, and this is where these images come from. The one on in the middle, on this one here, is interesting because she did various images all her life of her family, but they were never particularly flattering. In this particular case, she calls it the portrait of Jean-Louise, and this is 1947. And she makes it she was very excited about New York. She thought that New York was was going to be the future, and she loved the idea of skyscrapers. So she's made this sort of image of a skyscraper, really, with a little piece here of a house underneath. And this is basically, she wants Jean-Louis to grow up to be able to be part of this modern world. Now, the one on the end is particularly important because this one is called Sleeping Figure. And it was the first piece of sculpture purchased by Barr for MoMA, and it's called the Sleeping Figure. Now, the interesting thing about this is this was done in 1950. It's ambiguous. You can't tell whether it's a male or a female. And it's made actually of painted balsa. But this time she's still working in wood, but she's in a sense disguising the wood. For example, they were painted white. Okay, next one. Now here we're beginning to see, in my opinion, the real influence of Brancusi. This Brancusi group on the left came from a Whitney retrospective that was exhibited in America in 1955. And you can see there carved pieces of wood. They've got different names. The one on the extreme left, it's King of Kings. In the middle, it's the Sorceress. And on the right, it's Adam and Eve. These small pieces were, as I say, this big Whitney retrospective of the 90s. And on the right, we see Louis Bourgeois personages, and they were made in 1950 to 51. And they're all different. They all come from different sizes. And I'm putting them together because although she doesn't claim any male precedent, she is very angry about the surrealists. When they call her a surrealist later on, she gets very, very cross because it appears that they kind of despised her and they saw her work and they were very unhelpful. Okay, this is what she said. Okay, next one. Now, I think one of the most important influences she had were what was Max Ernst and Max Ernst's wife, Dorothea Tanning. Now, what we're looking at here is a Max Ernst. It's called Forest Dove, and it was made in 1927. And it's called something called grattage, and it was literally made by sort of scraping into paint so that the paint is almost three-dimensional, and it's sort of faintly like a forest, but in the middle there's that strange little bird. Now on the right, we see the sculptures that he made when he came to Paris. As you know, he married Peggy Guggenheim and then divorced her. He met Dorothea Tanning in 1942, and they married in 1944. And this particular one on the right, this series of a male and female, presumably, it's called Capricorn, and it's 1945. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing, not that she ever admitted the influence of Ernst, but I think it was there. Okay, next one. Because these are her works, actually, and the reason I put that forest on is because I think they're looking at that. This is her work in 1953. It's painted wood. The one on the left is called Night Gardens, and the one on the others is called One and Others, and they're both painted wood. One is 53 and one is 55. And I think there's no doubt that the influence from Ernst is obvious, really, here. Now, she had the only sort of male superior that she ever has any sort of relationship with is Duchamp. Because in 1940-44, she was asked to organize an exhibition which was called Documents of France. And it basically was called was a reference to the French underground, and it was put in a place called Royal Gallery of 1945, and she and Duchamp did it together. So her attitude to Duchamp was a little more sort of friendly than the others. Okay, next one. And so when you'll see, there's no doubt about it, I've put the Duchamps together. Now you all know the one on the left, which is the bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even, or the large glass, and that was done in 1915 and finished in America in 1923, because by now he is in America. Now the one on the right was a great secret. Nobody knew of his existence. He started it in 1946 and he finished it in 1966. And now you have to go to Philadelphia when you go into this strange room with a door on the end, with a little hole in the door, and you look through this hole and this is what you see in front of you. Now, this particular figure of the woman, it is thought, the model was Pierre Matisse's wife, Maria, and there was a long relationship. They had a long relationship for about 10 years, and they'd kind of given up at this particular moment. But she's thought to be the model. And of course, there is the nude holding the light with this, actually a photograph of landscape at the back. But it's a very shocking thing when you actually see it. But I think that there's no doubt that she saw it. And as I say, everybody knew about it by 1966. Okay, next one. Now, here are her first series of work made, modeled. These are modeled. These are modeled by Claire originally. And they're called, the group generally called Lair. And they're 1962. And they basically, the reference she talks about is they are made for basis of concealment. The top one in the middle, which I think is really quite strange, it's an eye form in a vagina. It's an eye in the middle of a vagina. And the one underneath is really doesn't have that doesn't have a title. The top is called The Regard, an eye in the form of a sexual organ. And the bottom one is just, hasn't got that's just, this is 1963. The top one is 1966. But the one on the right is possibly the most shocking. And it was hanging down, it was very large. It's called Fillet. And as you see, it's 1968. And it's a phallus wrapped up, swathed in a baby's blanket. And at the bottom of the phallus down here is a vagina. So it's one part of the female sex and male sex together. And this one, on the whole, she's proud of, and later on we'll see a photograph of it taken of it. And that was actually done in 1968. And these were all shown. She was not unknown, but she was only known to a very, very few, relatively few people. Let's look on the next one now. And I think this is really quite horrid. It's kind of a vagina, and it's just called Portrait. It's 1963, and it's latex, and it's a wall piece. And what is happening in the 60s is generally a new interest in sort of in new materials, really plastic. And what we're seeing in the middle is this extraordinarily brilliant woman, whom she doesn't talk about at all, though in fact was very famous at the time, and she's called Eva Hessel. Now, Eva Hessel was the daughter of a woman who had literally was in Auschwitz and just about made it to America. They came to America as she was a little girl, and she was very, very talented. And eventually she was actually studied with Joseph Albers at Yale. And she was fascinated by new materials. And we see a photograph of her here in her studio. She was born in 1936, but she died of a brain tumor in 1970, so she was only something like 34 years old when she died. And again, like, as we'll later see, Bourgeois, she was interested in these new materials, because what we see on the right is one of her untitled pieces, and this was 1969, and it's latex. Okay, next one. When we see these beautiful, I think this is extraordinarily beautiful. This was Hessel again, and this is in a gallery, and it's made of knotted pieces of rope which had been dipped in latex. And this is 1970. She died, as I say, of a brain tumor in 1970. This is just before she died. And the ones on the right are called Repetition, and they're made of fiberglass and polyester. And again, they're Eva Hessel. Now, I put her on because it shows you, the next one will show you Bourgeois' interest in this new material. Because the one on the left, that strange object on the left, is called Avenza, and it was originally made of plastic, but later it was, she repeated it in both in bronze and in marble. And the one on the left, which is a kind of strange coiled shape, and this is the same sort of image at the top, as you see, but she's put onto it a cloth, and then she's added over the whole thing latex, so it looks as if it's scrambling down. And these were done in 1968, 69, so they're the same time as Hessel's work. And she was showing these, but she wasn't, as I say, at this point, particularly well known. Okay, next one. But this, I think, is the most interesting image. And you know, this is the Venus of Villendolf, which I'm sure you'll all know, because this was discovered in 1908. It was actually discovered not far from Vienna in the Danube area, Villendolf, and it's 25,000 years old, and BC, and it's the first of the images, which really absolutely, when it was shown, completely excited most of the artists. And on the two rights, we see Bourgeois' interpretation of the same sort of image. And these, the middle one is called the Fragile Goddess. And this is 1970. And it's bronze with gold patina, as the other one is too. And that one has a strange title. It's called Harmless Women. And the reason that, again, you must remember, she was never short of money, because from 1967 to 1970, she spent masses of time in Italy in a place called Pietra Sant'Anna, and this is in 1967, when she learned to work with marble. She worked in the area where Michelangelo and so on found the marbles, and this is where she worked for over year after year. Okay, next one. And this is what we see here. We see her actually working here. And this is called, eventually it will call Sleep 2. And you see her working directly on the marble. And the one on the right is the finished up piece. She really is very, very able. She can do drawing, sculpture, and printing perfectly easily. She really is. That, by the way, the one on the right is 1967. So this is what the work that she's now doing. She's given up so much the idea of the plastic, and she's going back to the real materials. And we'll see by the next one. And this is the sort of thing that began to make her reputation, because we're now still in 69, and it's called Cumin 1. And she sees it as a series of clouds, but most everybody else sees it as phalluses with cloth round it at the bottom. You see it in white marble here. And really, she sees it, as I say, clouds But it really looks like phalluses emerging from the sort of cloth thing here. And as you see in the black one, it's much more directly onto the obvious, much more obvious. That's 68, and this is 69. She repeats this again and again in all sorts of ways. As I said, she's very, very strange when it comes to responding to her family. This very strange portrait is the portrait of her husband, Robert. This was done in 1969. And it's actually bronze painted white. And there's a sort of portrait perched on top of a sort of swarm of phallic forms. They look like phalluses. And the one on the right is done at exactly the same time. But this is a plaster one, and this is called the needle one. And this image of women working with needles in tapestry is going to continue right the way through her life. By now, this becomes her personal portrait, really. So with 1969, both of these two. Now, by the 1970s, the children presumably have gone away, and she's able to move. She's got a new big studio, and Robert Goldwater dies in 1973, and she really begins now to do the work of which we know her. Next one, and this is about it's called The Destruction of the Father. It's again latex and with a red light, and it's a kind of happening. It was done in 1974, and what we're looking at the right is a detail. It's faintly phallic symbols and also food. Now, she now begins to work on this particular group. It appears that her father was a violent man. He was a strong, shouting person. And her mother, she absolutely adored. Her mother was good-natured, easygoing, and had to put up with her father's infidelity. His infidelity was such that when she was a little girl, he employed an English tutor, a woman called Sadie, and she became his mistress. And this mistress stayed in the house for 10 years, from 1922 to 1932, when the mother died. And all her life, she is resentful of this situation because she felt her mother's position was so impossible. And I gather he was a very violent man. For example, when she decided she wanted to be an artist, he completely cut off the money. And the only way that she could afford to be taught is that by now she was an English speaker, and she was a docent for example, at the Louvre, for which she spoke English to the people. Okay, next one. Now we are very, very much more up to date now. Now we are now in the 70s, and this wonderful photograph of her wearing one of these plastic sex objects, which were half basically breasts, outside her door, because now they have a long time ago they've moved into Chelsea area, part of New York, and where she lives for the rest of her life. And she has an exhibition at the Hamilton Gallery, and it's a very funny one. It's called A Banquet, a Fashion Show of Body Parts. It's 1978. And in the center, it's the art historian Gert Schift wearing one of her things, which are all those breasts on that strange thing in the center. And on the right, we see confrontation. And this is it's about the father again. And it's actually a dinner table with all of these plastic elements, but they're on a stretcher. They're not on a table. They're on a medical stretcher. And round the edge are these kind of strange boxes to fence it in. And this is what we're seeing in the center. And now this is 1978. And the feminist movement has begun. And she's picked up by a woman called Deborah Wiley. And she's fashionable enough to have her first outside commission. Now I'm going to move over to my friend on the right, who is going to tell you where she got this particular inspiration from. It's terribly interesting because this particular was called the Norris Federal Building. And what is important about it is that it was a scientific building, and they were experimenting on energy conservation. Now, this is as early as 1978, and it takes place, this is all in their building in New Hampshire, in a place called Manchester. And this is her first outside commission. Now I'll ask Camilla to talk a little about this one.
So just by chance, while Pat was working on the lecture, I sort of popped in to interrupt her PowerPoint construction, and I saw this, and I asked her if she had all been looking at Robert Smithson. Now I'm not quite. Robert Smithson's an American artist, land artist working in the United States, sort of at the late 60s onwards, and again, she obviously must have looked.
It was informed, remember?
Yeah, we know him best for Spiral Jetty, which is that sort of a spiral that's made in the between the water with all those stones. But that was 1970, Spiral Jetty. But before that, he was on a trip to Mexico in 1969. And I particularly know him because of his expositions on ruins. He had a very positive view of ruins in the landscape. And he was in Mexico to photograph a kind of old eccentric hotel, which had fallen into decay. And he did a installation piece just by chance there called the Yucatan Mirror Displacements 1 to 9, where he installed around 12 sort of inch square mirrors into the site directly, almost like embedding them into the ground, very similar to how these are embedded into this, like, raised landscape here. And so what he did was, as he was a landscape artist, he couldn't very well sort of like move it into a gallery setting. So he would photograph his pieces, and the color photographs were then later published in Art Forum, which obviously she must have subscribed to.
She never, ever, ever. She never. This is very. I'm very, very grateful to Camilla, because all of the reading, she has never mentioned this one.
So curiously enough, Smithson published this in Art Forum with an accompanying essay. If you all ever get a chance to read his written works, they are terrific. I mean, talk about a guy who was without any type of an artist at the time working without any misogyny, just really creative and wild. And he published this piece called Incidents of Mirror Travel in the Yucatan. And this was 1969. Now, Pat, you said that this was done in
1978.
There you go. So like about 7, 8 years beforehand. So in Smithson's work, the mirrors reflect and refract the surrounding environment. And what they do is they displace the solidity of the landscape and shatter it into its various sort of pieces reflected in the mirror. So it's a part earthwork, part image. The displacements contemplate temporality, the passing of time, while the mirror records the passage of time. Its photograph suspends time. And here she's actually sort of progressing that further by putting it into a public space.
Now, what you're going to find, and this is terribly important, what you're going to find is her emphasis of mirrors. You're going to find her using mirrors again and again and again. And it must have been after this article that you're describing.
Well, to reflect, I mean,
it
mirrors
must have
as a
been.
trope to reflect
Yes, I
society
think it
back
must
onto
be
itself.
So, must
right?
be so. Anyway, this is just an interesting side issue. Okay, next, let's look at the next one, because here we go back to our obsession with phalluses and vaginas. The top one is called Fallen Woman. She's very accomplished sculptor, and this one is 1981, and it's bronze, and it's black and bronze. And the one on the bottom is femme couture, which means knife, and this is 1982, and this is pink marble. And the one on the rest is still called femme maison, and this is 83, and this is on 2 woolen tumblers, and this is marble. Now in 1982, she had her first, in fact, she was the first woman artist to have an installation completely devoted to her work in the MoMA. And this was entirely due to the influence of the feminist movement, which was absolutely rampant at this time. And this is when her international reputation begins. And we're talking about 1982. I want you to remember that she was 71 years old. She had given up. I mean, her children were away from her. Her husband was dead. She was on her own. And she's living in the house she'd always lived in. And she had this huge, she had enough money. She had this huge studio in Brooklyn. Okay, next one. And these are the works which are so interesting, because these are exactly, again, this particular obsession she's got. And this particular one on the left, which is called the Sea Fox, this is 1985, this one here. And it's sort of half dog and half woman. Very, very strange. She was very interested in spirals. She did a lot of spirals. She liked the idea of hanging works too. And so this middle one is a hanging work. And this is Spiral Woman of 1984. And as I say, she was a very accomplished sculptress, but the one on the right is extraordinary. This is much, much later, but I had to put it on because it's self-portrait, 2007, and it's half cat, but of course it's got 5 legs, you see, very strange, supporting it. And this is strange, strange bronze. And it's silver nitrate is what it's made of. It's an extraordinary piece. But this was done right at the end of her life. Okay, next two. And here we have some of the most extraordinary. This is when she goes on to this whole, because they're always about emotion. They're always about her life and how she has developed. And this particular one, she was enlisted by 1993. She was famous enough to be the American artist for the Venice Biennale, and this was 93, and she represents USA. And her work travels all over Europe by now. She has exhibitions in Prague, in Hamburg, and Montreal. And she starts this series of cells. These cells really respond to her memories of her childhood. This particular one is her period of hysteria. By all accounts, when her father died in 1951, she went into a kind of hysterical state. She was involved with a psychiatrist all of her life. She had very little time for Freud, but she was always with the psychiatrist. And this particular one is describing hysteria, the one on the left. It is steel bronze, and it refers, she says, to memory. She says the reference is to a 19th century French philosopher called Charcot, who researched hysteria. The figure on the right was The Arch of Hysteria, and that was done in 1992, 93, both of them the same time. And this particular one was the body of this particular model was the young man who becomes one of her supporters and lives and supports her for really, lives with her for the rest of her life. Okay, next two. These are so strange. We said about mirrors before. And these are called, the one on the left, are called velvet eyes. And aren't they creepy? Look at those eyes stuck into that strange marble piece. It's marble and steel. And the one on the right are the eyes and the mirrors. And this is the point. Not only are we looking at her, she's looking at us at the same time. And this is what these are all about. This particular group is one of the cells that she's now going to be absolutely devoted to for the next 5 or 6 years. Okay, next one, and this is what we're going to see. Now, remember me telling you right at the beginning that they had this time of this place in country. Well, this particular place they didn't actually own, they rented it. And it was a place called Choisy, Choisy. Now, this is a marble equivalent of the house that the family had. But look at the top, there is a guillotine at the top. This was the time, she says in her diaries, where she was they were at their happiness, at their happiest time. Because why? The father was in the First World War army. And this is when the children lived in the country alone with their mother. And this particular piece is a marble replica of the house, and it's 1990 to 1993. Now look at this one, which was one of the first cells, and this is 91. Now, if you can read all these things, we can just about see it, can't we? It says art is the guarantee. What does it say in the middle? I can't read.
Oh, no, guarantee of sanity.
About a guarantee of sanity. Art is guarantee.
Pain is the ransom of formalism.
At the bottom is.
Used memories are my documents.
These are embroidered in many cases and written on these places. This is one of the cells. Okay, next one. And here, actually, I was managed to find a photograph of what they actually look like. Do you remember this right at the beginning? And I think this is very important. When all of her work, you, the visitor, become part of. You move in and out of the images all the time. And this particular one is the Installation 5, one of the cells. And this is 1991. And on the right, you see a detail of it. She used old doors, old bits of wood to make these things. So a combination. The two shapes in the center always refer to her parents. I think in this case, they seem to be sort of three-dimensional. Sometimes they're just pieces of wood. Okay, next two. This one, I think, is extraordinary. One of the things that's fascinating about her, she never throws anything away. It appears that when she has to give up her studio in Brooklyn because they're pulling it down to rebuild, she had a huge loft studio. It was absolutely packed. She had her mother's old clothes, her own old clothes, and this is one of the cells with all the clothes inside. There are several of these. I've just chosen a couple, and this is just Cell's clothes of 1996, and this is a detail of it. And in the center, you see that little three-dimensional object, which is a spiral staircase, because in her studio, she had designed and had made a spiral staircase, which was inordinately fond. And when she had to give up the studio, the spiral staircase came back to the house. I gather the house was actually jam full of all this stuff. Okay, next one. And this is one of the strangest ones. This is called Dangerous Passage. And this is masses of mixed media, which all refer to images and to things of her childhood. It appears that her father collected antique chairs. And so you see at the end here, the chairs. But you as a voyeur, as a person, you enter it, you go through it like this. And this detail expresses this better than this particular thing. And this is 97. She is going to have the most important exhibition of her life, next one. And this is going to be the beginning of the spider. And she says, I do, I undo, I redo. The spider is the figure of mother. And she says in this piece, it's I love you no matter what. The undo is the torment that things are not right and the anxiety of not knowing what to do. There can be total destruction, an attempt to find an answer. There can be terrific violence that distends. One is immobile in the wake of fear. And then redo means the solution is found to the problem. It may not be the final answer, but there is an attempt to go forward. You get to terms of relationship to others. The reparation and reconciliation has been achieved. Things are back to normal. And this is the expression of the spider. And the next one is her very, very most famous piece. And this was the beginning of beginning of Tate Modern. We're looking in 2000, and this is the opening of Tate Modern. And she's given this extraordinary space to do this huge spider, this incredible spider. And it is 30 feet tall. And she's given a wall space inside the turbine hall in the Tate Modern, and that is 3 steel towers. And it is extraordinary, really, because this is perhaps, she says it's one of the most interesting things. This begins that she's made, or several versions are made of it, but this is the first really large one. Okay, next to her, this is 2000. Now we're looking at the ones inside the photograph. Look at when you get up to that staircase. Remember, they are interested in the spiral staircase. Here is a spiral staircase inside. But when you get to the top, what do you see? Huge mirrors. Remember the mirrors that we talked about earlier? This is what we see. I do, I undo, and redo. And this is the top of the towers of 2000. Okay, next one. Now, this is her studio, her beloved studio that she had to give up. And on the floor, this is actually part of the maman being made. And at the back are all sorts of pieces from that. Now, when she gave it up, it was terrible. And the very last of her cells actually is talking about that sadness. It's the end of the Brooklyn studio, and this is the last one. This was 95, and she completed this particular one in 2008. And inside it, you see the staircase from Brooklyn, and the big shapes on the bottom, which the spheres are her parents. And these extraordinary glass objects are the fact that the future will be better. This is presumably what it's about. It's the last one. But in 2001, so famous by now is she, that she has an exhibition in St. Petersburg. And she's the first American artist ever to have an exhibition in the Hermitage. Isn't that interesting? First living US artist to have that. Now I'm going to show you how I think she is dependent upon Dorothea Tanning for the last work. Because what we're seeing here is the Dorothea Tanning installation in the Pompidou. And this is full of soft sculpture. Remember, she married Ernst in 1944, and they lived in America. This was done in 1970 to 73, and these are the first time we see the soft sculpture. It absolutely terrified me when I saw it in the Pompidou. And it's the Shaumbra 2002 from the Hotel de Pavot. This is what it's called. And on the right, we see Bourgeois' couple of 2001. Now, I'm sure that she'd certainly seen the tanning, okay, next to her. This, I think, is strange. It's one of the creepiest, really. It's called Lady in Waiting. It's a bad photograph because the detail, I think, is much clearer. Do you see this tapestry, which now you're going to see the way the tapestry is completely full, always talking about the tapestry and, of course, her mother. And in this case, the tapestry figure is encased in the spider. And this one is 2003. And on the right, it's a detail from the tanning, and it's a figure in the chair. And she calls it the end of the month. But I do think that she knew this. Okay, next to, again, tanning. And in her case, this strange figure, which is untitled. It was done in 1999, and this is in the exhibition now, which is at the Hayward. And the tanning is by What Love, it's called, it's 1970. And the single figure is Bourgeois, and that's 96. This is in the Hayward. And they are made of in this sort of strange blue denim stuff, really. Okay, next one. And this one again is these are tanning. This one is called the pig cushion to serve as a fetish. And this was done earlier, but this is the later, bigger one, which was in 1979. And the one on the one, which is the embrace, I think is absolutely wonderful. That was 1969. These are tanning. Okay, next. And we see now Bourgeois. We see this very strange experience she has about bearing children. Remember, they adopted. She didn't think she could bear children to begin with, and then she managed to bear 2. And these are generally called Do Not Abandon Me. And they're made of this strange pink stuff. And they're done in 1999. Okay, next one. Look at this one. Isn't this strange? This attitude debate is so interesting. She begins as fabric sculpture, by the way, in 98. And remember, she's at the age of 86 when she begins this. We talk about an old age life, but this woman is reimagining things, completely changing the style at 86. It's really quite remarkable. This is called the Reticent Child, and the other one is called the Woven Child. And they're one of 6 elements, and they were done in 2002 and 2003. And they're really quite remarkable. Okay, next to this one, I think is funny. It's called 7 in a Bed, and it's 2001. And I think it's really very funny. Male and female figures. The other one is slightly more horrid, I think. That's 2001 on the left, but the middle one was earlier. This is just called horizontals. And it's the mother, the daughter, and a small decapitated child. Attitude to childbirth is very interesting. These figures are sort of much more horrid than the others. They're sort of mixed material, which doesn't really work. Okay, next one. Again, Tanning on the left. I felt that we had to show how important, because it says nowhere in all the articles I've read, there is not one reference to Dorothea Tanning, which I think is a bit unfair. Myself, I mean, I just do feel that this is not really fair. This one, the only one that has a name, and it has the name of the mysterious brother who died in 1990. It's called Pierre, and it's 1998. It's the only named one. I think the untitled one is really of great anxiety. There's something quite terrifying. Remember, this is done the same time as those three. The horizontal ones, they're made up of this strange mixture of cloth that make them somehow much more frightening. Okay, next one. Because some of these are quite beautiful, actually. I think. They're untitled. The first one is called Rejection, which is understandable. That's 2001. They're 2001, 2002, and 2003. And they're made, as you see, of old pieces of tapestry. Remember this, always the connection of the tapestry background. Okay, next one. These are so strange. This is called Couple. And for some reason, it's got a prosthetic leg. But the one on the right, I think, is funny. And that's called High Heels. Can you just see high heel shoes on the bottom here of this strange object? Is it male or female or both? It's very difficult to see in this particular one. This is 97 and 98, both of these. And we're talking about a very old lady. She's doing this herself. Okay, next up. And by the way, she wasn't the least bit interested in selling the stuff. Often she'd give them away. And I should mention that from about 1995, 96, she had the Sundays, she called them Bloody Sundays. And young students, people were allowed to come to the house where she had these very frightening sort of meetings with them. The art student, they'd show the work and she'd make them describe it and make them say why they did it. You can see some of this on the television. If you look it up, it's quite interesting.
Like crits.
They're crits, but she's not at all soft. This is called The Reticent Child, and it was an installation piece of 2003. And this is a detail we see on the right, but here you see the whole relatively complicated, and they're all about various stages of pregnancy and birth. And she was fascinated by this at this particular time. Now, the final group I want to show you is the reference of the pictures that were not actually exhibited until after her death. And these generally are called Do Not Abandon Me. At some point, Tracey Emin went to New York and she went to see one of these Sundays. And she and Bourgeois became very, very friendly. And they communicated with each other all the time. And they decided to do a piece of work together. And this collaboration was generally called Do Not Abandon Me. Now, basically, there are a series of watercolors and oil colors which are done by Bourgeois. And the drawing and the writing is by Tracey Emin. She didn't exhibit until after her death. She died at the 31st of May in 2010. And this exhibition is 2012, I think. And they're a mixture, the watercolors are a mixture of male and female torsos in profile. And they were passed on to Emin, who says that she spent a long time not knowing what to do with them. But finally, she got it together, and all the drawings and the writings are hers. And these were published in a series of 18 sets. And there are 6 artist proofs. And Penny has one of them. Okay, next to. She has this one, actually, which is interesting. These are 2 about do not abandon me. This is very funny. The little drawing, the drawings are Emin. The watercolors, or the colors are Bourgeois. I can't read what that says. I can't read those stories. I can see I love, because that's all I can see on that one. And they're very strange. Look at the next one. And So I Kissed You is very funny. This is, of course, Emin. And I Wanted to Love You More. And as I said, what I was reminded of when I saw them was the latest Emin exhibition I saw at the Royal Academy a couple of years ago. And this particular pink, I noticed that Emin had taken over completely. She's very, very influential to women artists. Okay, next 2. And this is the last one. I think this is absolutely extraordinary, because this one was just briefly showing her ability, her drawing and so on, which I've not really talked about because she was always doing this. And this is just called The Fragile of 97. And the one in the center, I think, is so interesting because it's a spider. This time it's got this center, is, as you see, the tapestry. And it happens to be 2003, this little spider. And that wonderful photograph of her looking highly amused as you see her holding that huge phallus. And this picture was done by Mapplethorpe in 1982. Now, you see, I think, as I said, when I started, I truthfully was not wild about her. And she was extraordinary, really. But I think I have here a quotation from, incidentally, I thought one of the best reviews were by a man called Adrian Searle.
Here, yes. Wasn't it here? You marked that?
Oh, yes, I marked this one.
Yeah.
Yes, it said, Bourgeois came to artistic maturity long after motherhood, widowhood, and menopause. On the brink of old age, she became a child again, free to reinvent herself and her world. Hard became soft, iron became glass, out turned to in. Categories existed only to be subverted. From within her beyond feminist panoply of contradictions, Bourgeois will continue to mock all certainty, not least certainty about the artist herself. I think that's a brilliant way of describing her. Okay, thank you.